Today, I am very excited to be talking to Lisa Marchiano, who's an award-winning author, podcaster, and certified Jungian analyst. And I found you through the Depth Psychology podcast, This Jungian Life, which
Mhm.
I've learned so much from, and I look forward to listening to every new episode. And I also wanted to talk to you specifically because of how your work draws on the wisdom of fairy tales to help, especially women, connect more deeply with themselves. And this is the
Mhm.
theme kind of at the center of your new book, which is called The Vital Spark: Reclaim Your Outlaw Energies and Find Your Feminine Fire. So, very juicy title.
Mhm.
It's a wonderful book full of wonderful wisdom. And I'm just very excited to talk to you about reclaiming outlaw energies today and everything else that comes up. So, welcome. Welcome to the face of the deep.
Thank you. It's really
Yeah.
great to be here.
So I thought we could just start because the people who are listening to this are probably like me, coming out of the evolutionary psychology world or
Mm.
adjacent to it, and may not know what Jungian thinking is at all, and certainly what Jungian analysis is or how it differs from therapy. And there's kind of this idea that it's a Freudian kind of tell me about your mother, sort of
Mhm.
lie on the
Mhm.
couch and retread old traumas. And so if you can just kind of ground us in what kind of defines Jungian psychology and
Mhm.
analysis in particular, and what
Mhm.
makes it different, and also what drew you to this world.
Mhm. Boy, that's
Big question.
yeah, it is a big question. So let's see. So Freud and Jung were colleagues. I would say that Freud was Jung's mentor for a little while, but then they had this significant break, and the break was really over the understanding of kind of psychic energy, which Freud saw as sexual in nature. So he had this term libido, which really meant, sexual energy. And
Mhm.
for Jung, libido meant something really different. It was just general life energy, just general life force. And he saw that people were motivated by a range of different instincts. So for Freud, the sex drive was predominant, but Jung said, well, we have an instinct to eat, we have an instinct to procreate, we have an instinct for religion. And I mean, and this is interesting because I mean, I think it's much truer to what we understand about what does motivate people on an instinctual level. I do think that there is a real um, evolutionary psychology and Jungian psychology for me fit together very well.
Yeah, I think so too. Yeah.
And it's been, evolutionary psychology, as far as I can tell, kind of perched on the outside looking in. It's something that really interests me, but and it has always, by the way, interestingly, I've always been interested in it,
Mhm.
like from when I was a kid. It's sort of like what makes us tick, and it makes sense that we could understand that from the sense of, well, how did we, you know, what behaviors are kind of programmed in because they're
Mhm.
adaptive. And I think that I don't know that Jung ever talked about that per se, but he really thought like that.
Mhm.
And I know that, at least, and again, my view of evolutionary psychology is that it's pretty controversial, because when evolutionary psychologists make statements like, well, the way that men and women might experience sex is different,
Mhm.
you know, the rest of the world goes absolutely
Get
nuts.
my smelling salts. Yes.
Yeah, because it's like you're saying something that might be true, but that we don't want it to be true. And so we say, well, you're trying to tell us how we should be. It's like, no, no, no. We're just saying what is, you know.
Mhm. Mhm.
So, and I think that Jung falls into that a lot too. It's just he's very phenomenal. I'm getting away from the question, but he's very phenomenological in that I think he just looked at what he saw and tried to
Yeah.
describe it.
Yeah.
So, so he was interested, yes, in what you said before about, that Freud was interested in sort of retreading old wounds and that kind of thing.
Mhm.
Yes, Jung was interested in that, but he wasn't only interested in that, and he thought that only looking for. In fact, there's some great place where he talks about, if you do that, you're going to spend the whole time, kind of searching for old traumas.
Mhm.
And I think that that is a real danger of psychotherapy, actually. And it's like, well, there must be something in my past that, and then you go off looking for it. And yeah, there might be something in your past, or that might account for part of it. But Jung was also interested in what he called the prospective function of the psyche. So where do things want to go? Where are we tending towards? Where's the arc of growth and development? And so sometimes symptoms are about that, not about something that happened to us when we were 4.
Mm-hmm.
So he had a kind of a fundamentally different view of the psyche than Freud, although there were points that they agreed on.
Mm-hmm.
But it's he was very interested in meaning. He felt that we all have a need to have a sense of meaning in our lives, and that if we don't, we can experience symptoms. So
Mm-hmm.
it's you asked me kind of what drew me to it. I, I found the little bit of Freud that I was exposed to in the popular culture to paint a kind of ugly picture of human nature.
Mm-hmm.
And Jung fundamentally paints a redemptive, beautiful picture of human nature because he believed that we were all essentially unfolding toward wholeness,
Mm-hmm.
and that symptoms often arose when we were blocked in some way from unfolding toward wholeness. And I think that's mostly true. He was not naive.
Mm-hmm.
He does acknowledge that they're just kind of frank cases of pathology, or just things don't work.
Mm-hmm.
But it's a fundamentally optimistic view of human nature and human development.
Yeah, no, that's great. It's a great place to start, and I think it segues nicely into the theme of your book, which is that these sort of unclaimed energies, particularly for women, these kind of 8 essential qualities, which are more qualities that we would think of certainly in the evolutionary psychology world as more masculine,
Yeah.
in nature. We're
Hmm.
talking about sort of, shrewdness and disagreeableness and even rage, and these things that are in the conventional understanding of it, not intrinsic to women biologically as
Right.
much.
Right.
And you're also making the argument that many of these kind of core energies are left behind and abandoned in early life because they're unacceptable by our
Hmm.
developmental environment or for any number of reasons. So I guess threading that needle between what is intrinsically feminine versus what is abandoned and needs to be
Right.
reclaimed, where do you find yourself navigating that, and how do you
Hmm.
deal with that in the book?
It was really important to me in the book to say that some of our tendency, so in general, right, we know that women are more agreeable, let's say. The
Mm-hmm.
research on, big 5 personality traits. I mean, I think that's a very kind of
Mm-hmm.
robust finding as I understand it. So let's just look at that for a second. Most people will say in kind of, common discourse will say, well, that's because of the patriarchy and female socialization.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, yes, and is some part of that innate? And I believe, frankly, that it is. And I believe that both because it makes sense to me from an evolutionary standpoint, quite frankly, because yeah, I mean, we need to be sort of, we as women, makes sense that we would be very attuned to other people's needs, for example, because we're the main ones who make sure that the next generation survives.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but there's also really good research about this, and it comes from several different areas. It comes from uh, cross-cultural. So, you may be aware, people have compared like Sweden, which is incredibly kind of, there's a
Right.
ton of gender equality in Sweden versus, a place like Pakistan. And
Mm-hmm.
and actually, women in Pakistan were more likely to become engineers, and women in Sweden are more likely to become like nurses.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, but also there's that big 5 finding, I think, has been done cross culturally, and it's very stable. And some of this research is done on neonates, so babies that are a few days old that really haven't been exposed to socialization, and in primatology, even in primates, there are
Mm-hmm.
differences. Okay, so it makes sense to me, and it seems like there's evidence for it, and of course, how much of it is innate, how much of it is cultural, certainly there's a big cultural piece. I'm not denying that at all. But I think it matters to say, listen, some of this might be innate, because if you're going to contend with the fact that you've spent so much of your life being so damned agreeable that you haven't figured out who you are, and you've got to start doing that work, it helps to know that you might have to jump over an inner injunction against being disagreeable.
Mm.
Right? That's what you're up against, that you're up against not just kind of cultural programming, but even a sort of innate demand that you be agreeable, for example. And I put that in the book, and books these days are always sent to sensitivity readers.
Mm.
And the sensitivity reader said, "You're being essentialist." And I said to my editor, I said, "Listen, I think this is important." And I've been clear that, I think my phrase in the book is something like, because of this evidence, it is plausible that. So
Yeah, you're
I'm
definitely
not
creative, very
categorical about it, but
yeah.
I said, and I think it matters. I think it's a different experience to say, well, I'm just this way because patriarchy made me this way, than to say, well, you know what, this is my makeup, and if I want to change it, then that's, that I have to think about what I need to do to work against my nature in some sense.
Right.
So by the way, I will say that I know plenty of women who wouldn't really relate to my book, because I have a friend last night, I gave her a copy. I'm like, you do not need this, because there are certainly women that do not have a problem being assertive, being shrewd, being disagreeable. I mean, I think I have a lot of those people in my life, because although I am not one of them, I really admire that. They're sort of, they can be kind of difficult in a wonderful way, but that's probably a minority of women, let's say. I think most of us, the traits that I chose to talk about, there are 8 of them, and my list doesn't have any special authority, but it's just sort of what I came up with. Someone else might have another list, but it's disagreeableness, shrewdness, trickster, desire, sexuality, rage, authority, ruthlessness. Yeah, and ruthlessness. Ruthlessness is the last one. And I can talk about more about how I see those. But most of us are going to have trouble. Most women, a majority of women, I think, are going to have trouble really stepping into being disagreeable, really stepping into being ruthless, really stepping into holding authority or feeling comfortable with anger. And I do think there are probably like estrogen and testosterone are like, they're really different. For one thing, that's part of it.
Yeah, very powerful drugs. Yeah.
Yes, they are.
Yeah. This kind of ties into a broader question of the kind of idea of transformation at midlife too. So this is a very popular theme in Jungian work, and
Yes.
it does seem to be the lived experience of most people who kind of come to Jungian thinking, or who come to analysis, or who get interested in reclaiming these outlaw energies. So if you get to a point in life and you realize the agreeableness and the subservience and the not owning your power is not working for you anymore,
Right.
it's sort of the question of, yes, there is this project that needs to happen of you. My colleague and Doug Lyle and I have been on a podcast together called Beat Your Genes. So you're beating your genes, you're beating your inherent nature to seize these what you have this rightful claim to. But you may not be able to do it or have the willingness to do it until midlife forces it upon you.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about, and this is true in the fairy tales too, that you weave throughout the book, that basically the young girls in the fairy tales don't get in touch with these attributes of themselves until forced by very dire
Mm-hmm,
circumstances.
mm-hmm.
Is it possible for people to undergo this kind of transformation without pain, or without being cornered by life in a really painful way? Or is that just part of the necessary soup of moving into a more full version of who we are, that unfolding that you talked about?
I mean, probably it's not possible to do it without some pain because there has to be an incentive, right? There has to be a sense that, oh, this is not working anymore. But of course, it's sort of like an AA, you have to hit bottom, right? Before you get better. It's like, well, we all have different bottoms. You can have a high bottom or a low bottom. You can sort of, you know, come in one day to work and realize you're sick of being treated like a second class citizen, and that's it for you. And other people maybe have to go through much more painful experiences before they realize that they've got to uh, beat their genes. I like that. But it's related to this idea of the shadow, which is kind of popular now in the culture, that you know th- there are things that we get rewarded for as children, let's say, and this definitely speaks to the kind of acculturation piece of it. There are behaviors and attitudes that we manifest that we're rewarded for, that we learn are valued by our caregivers, by our parents, by our teachers, by the culture. And then there are others that's like, no, I'm not supposed to be that way. So the things that we don't develop because we learn that they're not highly valued kind of go off, and they're there in the background. They don't just go away. We still have the potential to be, let's say, assertive. Let's just use that. That's a potential in all of us, and it's just at what point do we claim that? Do we lean into it? Do we develop it really? Because becoming assertive effectively kind of takes practice. And if you think about it, some people sort of feel comfortable practicing that from early on, and
Yeah.
partly by dint of what the messaging that they receive by the culture, and partly by dint of probably temperament. But others of us maybe didn't practice that, and then we get to be whatever age, and we're like, oh man, we've got to practice that. And that is, to speak to your point about midlife, reclaiming those potentials that we didn't develop is often a part of a midlife transformation that can be very vivifying, because those unclaimed potentials that have been kind of lying in the unconscious, they have a lot of energy attached to them. So you literally get more energy when you start doing this kind of work.
Yeah. So my experience of this, and I think it's common to a lot of people, is that it's vivifying, but it's also terrifying, because
Yes.
the life as you know it is falling apart, and the relationships that you have that are built on contracts between who people assume
Yes.
that you are and want you to be are now
Yes.
suddenly, they're falling apart. They're not predictable. People might be inclined to move away from you. This was my experience when I got sober a decade ago. That part of
Mm-hmm.
recovery work is the same thing. It's, you get a lot of this, I don't even know who you are anymore. You're
Yep.
not the person I
Yep.
married. You're not,
Yes.
the friend that I knew in college. Who are you? So
Mm-hmm.
this idea of the confrontation with the shadow, and whether the shadow includes these reclaimed energies and lots of other things, that through that process we do acquire more energy, and it's very exciting, and we find some life and energy in that, but there's a lot of loss too.
Well, it is a destructive process because it does destroy I want to say maybe the persona that you've been living with, or some of the assumptions that you've had about yourself. So there is definitely a destructive aspect of it. So you're right. It's terrifying. I mean, I give the example in the book on the chapter on rage of this woman who had, she'd had this marriage, and she'd been taking care of her kids, and she'd pretty much swallowed her own. She had accommodated herself to her husband and her kids continually, and kind of always put her own needs kind of second, and just what do they need, and it was a lot of, it was subtle in a way, but it was a lot of kind of emotional accommodation. Her husband could be kind of off in his own world, and kind of a little morose, and she was always trying to kind of fluff him up and make sure he was in an okay mood so that he wouldn't, say something to upset one of the kids. It was that kind of thing, right? Well, she just didn't even realize she was doing it. And then she has this, kind of an event that sort of set her off, and she really kind of blew up. And then, she had this incredible dream about, that she's sitting in a nice restaurant dining with her husband, and people start talking about, oh, there's this band of marauders coming through.
Mm.
And so, in the dream, she looks at her husband, she says, we should get out of here right now. They leave, they don't pay the check or anything. They leave, they go to the parking lot. She's like, oh, we're about to get away. But then the band of marauders come out, stream out of the trees across the field and are coming toward them. And she knows it's too late. I can't avoid this confrontation. And the leader of the band of marauders, which is known to be incredibly destructive and violent, is a woman.
Yes.
So there's her image of her feminine rage, which had been kind of disallowed, and it's been living out in the wilds,
Yeah.
getting really wild, and it seems like it's going to be incredibly destructive. So her associations in the dream was this was going to be bloody. There was going to be like kind of a machete kind of job. It was horrifying. But there was a lot of destruction, because that was an important moment in the marriage where she sort of said, I'm not going to do this anymore, and she didn't know what was going to happen. She didn't know if it was going to make it, but it was a real turning point, and the marriage certainly wasn't going to get any better if she hadn't done that. So the risk was, maybe I'll do this and we'll wind up divorced.
Right.
But that is not, in fact, what happened. And they, the marriage got a lot better after that, because she wasn't pulling her punches. She needed to find that aggressive energy that was kind of in her buried rage.
Yeah, I love that dream, because it's so often when you have a dream about bad guys or bad women in this case, and there's somebody I had a recurring dream often in childhood of someone trying to invade the house, trying to get in the house, and there's someone trying to get in, and there's always this fear that we have to get away from this bad guy, or we have to run away, or we have to hide from them. But almost always in the analysis of the dream, and on your podcast, the three of you often will go, have dreams that have these components, and you'll go through this analysis of them. The thing that is trying to get in and attack you or destroy you is usually something that needs to be welcome, that needs to be integrated. It's not the idea of sitting in that suburban bland restaurant with her husband in a state of peace is actually the problem, not the marauders. And that's an intuition that people don't generally have, and so they have a scary dream like that and misinterpret it, thinking, oh, this
no,
this
something's
is telling
coming to
me
get me.
yeah, I need to double down on my mediocrity. and so dream work, and this makes many, I love how the book it dances between fairy tales and your clinical experience and your personal experience and dreams, and all of these things kind of come together to paint these pictures of these energies and how important they are to integrate. What would you tell people about paying attention to their dream life and engaging active imagination? That's something that has been a game changer for me, and I think could be a great tool for a lot of people as well, to access their own inner fairy tales, essentially.
Well, dream work really can be transformational, and it's beautiful, and it's fun, and it's with us every night. So to me, it's just miraculous,
Yeah.
And I'm glad you asked, because our new book is coming out on November 12th.
Oh, amazing.
And it's called Dreamwise: Unlocking the Meaning of Your Dreams.
Oh.
And I am so excited about it, because I think that we have done something pretty special, which is we've taken Jungian dream work and the best of the kind of post-Jungian dream work, the most practical stuff, and said, here's what you do. It's when we were writing it, I kept on saying, okay, so it's like, how do you teach someone to tie their shoe? You say first you take both the top, the laces, and then you cross them over, and then you loop one around the other, and then you pull. And that's sort of what we've done with Dreamwise, which is really, you know it's like I was always saying, it's a cookbook. There's really a recipe for how to work with your dreams. So it's very practical. It's very hands-on. Hopefully it's also a really fun read, and beautiful and inspiring too. So I don't want you to think it's a drudge, but it
Mm-hmm.
really breaks down how to do this, including a chapter on active imagination.
Very
So
cool.
if you're curious at all, I hope you'll pre-order Dreamwise, or order it if you're listening to this after November 12th.
Yeah.
Because I think I actually think it's probably the book I've worked on that I'm most proud of. So.
And you wrote it with the co-hosts of
Mm-hmm.
Jungian Life.
Yeah,
Oh, that's
with the other
awesome.
Josephs.
That's
Yeah.
wonderful.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that'll be a great practical guide for people,
Mm-hmm.
particularly people who are very unfamiliar with, working with dreams at all, or very dismissive of them. And,
Mm-hmm.
oh, I just ate too much pizza last night or
Right.
something. So,
Right. Right.
yeah, but dreams are very, very powerful.
They
Yeah.
certainly are. And I think, you sort of hit on one of the main points, which oftentimes dreams show us, I think, our defenses, what we're defending
Mhm.
against.
Mhm.
So in this dream, the dreamer was really defending against her rage.
Mhm.
And she, in the dream, she's trying to run away from it. I think it's a great detail that she was going to leave the bill unpaid.
Yeah, that's
She had a lot
wonderful.
of unpaid bills because
But
she
she was
hadn't
gonna
dealt with
call the
this.
next day
Right,
and pay
right.
it. Even
Mm-hmm.
her conscientiousness and her
Right.
agreeableness is still there, even in the
Yes.
dream. Like, I
Yes.
reassured myself that I would call the next day and pay it.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
yeah,
But she can't defend against it any longer. It's coming
yeah,
toward her. So
yeah, yeah,
it's good to know what we're defending against, because that's, we need our defenses, but that's often also where we're cutting ourselves off from life.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, the question of it's coming for you anyway, and the question of your fate, it's out there in this disheveled, wild state, and it has to be encountered, and it's not going to leave you alone. And so you see
Mm-hmm.
this in the hero's journey, and
Yep.
this is just a very familiar trope through all kinds of
Mm-hmm.
myth and literature and fairy tale, that this isn't necessarily a volitional process. I mean,
No,
it is and
no.
it isn't, where like it will keep knocking, it'll keep summoning
Mm-hmm.
you, and you can continue to say no, but the cost of saying no gets higher and higher as life goes on.
That's right.
And so the surrender to your fate, and the wonderful story that you have of the princess just throwing bread repeatedly
Isn't that a
at her
great
fate. I
story?
love that story
Oh,
because
God.
it's exactly what it is, that you encounter it and you hate it and you want to run away from it, and because it represents all of these shadow qualities,
Mm-hmm.
and many other shadow qualities that you're very happy to be projecting those onto other people and not dealing with them in
Mm-hmm.
yourself.
Mm-hmm.
But
Mm-hmm.
that metaphor of you just keep feeding it and nurturing it and giving it attention, and it doesn't happen instantly. You don't immediately tame this thing, but you win it over to your side, and
Mm-hmm.
allow it to co-create with you. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, the what say you about all that?
Well, I wonder if, for the sake of the listeners, I should just tell that story
Yeah,
briefly.
I think so. Yeah,
So
that's
it's a Greek fairy tale called The
yeah.
Princess Who Changed Her Fate. And so there was a king and a queen, and they had three daughters, and it was the oldest daughter. Um, uh, just had terrible things happen to her all the time, and there were no suitors showing up for any of them. And so the queen asked a wise woman to come and tell her what was going on, and the wise woman, took a look at what was going on and said, your eldest daughter has an evil fate. And
Mm,
as long as she has an evil fate, she's not going to get married, and then her younger sisters can't get married. So
mm,
the eldest princess heard this, and she said, I know what I have to do. I have to go away and sew some money in the hem of my dress, and I'll be off. So she does. And as she leaves, two suitors show up for her sisters.
mhm,
So she goes to kind of make her way in the world. And I think the first night she finds herself at a glass shop, and she says, can I stay here and work? And they say, yes. But that night, she's asleep in the shop, and her evil fate comes and smashes all the glass.
mm,
And so she has to, she gives them some money to pay for the damage. She keeps on going. Anyway, things like this continue to happen to her until she comes to another kingdom, and she finds some work with a kindly queen there who can see that she's of noble birth, and she's doing the embroidery, but things are always going wrong, and the queen is wise, though. She knows what's going on. She says, you have an evil fate, and you've got to change it. And the princess says, well, how do I do that? She says, well, you've got to climb up that mountain over there, and where the fates live, and then you've got to wait until you find your fate, and then you can't leave without giving her something to eat. So she takes some bread with her, and she goes up the mountain, and the first person to appear on the other side of the gate is this beautiful young woman with curly blonde locks and a bright smile, and she says, are you my fate? And she says, oh, I don't think
Fingers
so.
crossed.
I'm not your fate. So she
No.
she goes through this several times with this haggard, snaggletooth, woman comes up, with this sort of vicious demeanor, and it's like, oh yeah, that's my fate. And she just keeps on throwing the bread at her, and the fate keeps on, rejecting it. But finally she takes it. And then she says, okay, here's what you've got to do. And she says that, here's some thread. Do not sell this thread for, make sure you don't sell it for too cheaply, essentially, is what she tells her. And then it winds up that there's a prince in a nearby kingdom who's about to get married, and they need some more thread for the bride's dress. And wouldn't you know it, the thread that her fate gave her is the perfect thread. And in different versions of the story, he ditches the original fiance and marries our heroine. But in others, I think, that works out, and then she marries the king or something like that. So, and then they live happily ever after. So it's a wonderful story about changing our fate, which is something that brings a lot of people into therapy, actually.
Sure.
It's like,
yeah.
they don't say it like that, but this hasn't worked out for me. That hasn't worked out for me. I had this thing. How do I change my fate?
Yeah. And how do you have discernment about what is just bad luck and what is your inner nature or your fate or your acorn trying to show itself to you? That if things just aren't working and your relationships are falling apart and you're just facing crisis after crisis. I mean, I think when you're far enough down the track of Jungian thinking, you see everything as a clue. Everything is feedback about whether you're on the right path or not. But that is going to be the incipient midlife crisis, or the crisis that gets you into this place of, okay, I need to start throwing bread at it. So what does throwing bread at it look like if life is not working?
Yeah. Well, I think it means, like you said, kind of building a relationship with it, getting curious about it. And there is no recipe. There's no recipe for what it looks like to throw bread at your fate. But I think bemoaning your fate, saying, God, why does this always happen to me? I'm so unlucky, and this is so unfair. That doesn't get you very far. I mean, it's understandable, and we all probably need to spend some time there. But then that's not going to lead to change. So I think the biggest thing is kind of getting curious about it. Like why does this always happen to me? Why has this happened to me so many times? If I may, can I read a quote?
Please, yeah.
From Jung. I love my Jung quotes.
You do. I always wonder how you have them so ready to go.
So here it is. This is a great quote that just speaks to right what we're talking about. So this is Jung. But no matter how much the parents and grandparents may have sinned against the child, the man who is really adult will accept these sins as his own condition, which has to be reckoned with. Only a fool is interested in other people's guilt, since he cannot alter it. The wise man learns only from his own guilt. He will ask himself, who am I that all this should happen to me? To find the answer to this fateful question, he will look into his own heart. So if you've had a string of failed relationships and nothing ever works out for you, in your profession, I mean, it's that reckoning sense of, okay, what is going on? Not with any kind of self-blame, not like, oh, look, I'm fucking up again, but that's sort of like, what is happening to me? Why is this happening to me? And that's that sort of making friends with our fate. And
Mm.
oftentimes making friends with our fate is what allows it to change and shift.
Mm-hmm. So much of contemporary therapy and therapy culture does, as you alluded to early on, get to that first stage of why am I this? Why do I self-sabotage like this? Well, let's look at what happened to you when you were a kid, and let's
Yeah.
spend a lot of time in this trauma mongering, parent
Yes.
blaming space, but without then making that transition into, because of those circumstances, there were these pieces of yourself that were exiled and you need
Mm-hmm.
to reclaim them.
Yeah.
That's the bridge that doesn't happen in a lot of therapy or a lot of self-help, or however people pursue this kind of thing. They can get halfway there, but
Yep.
then the actual work of learning to love your fate and responding
Mm-hmm.
to the call to adventure, that's much harder for people, I think.
I think that's exactly right, and I think that happens a lot in therapy, and I think it also happens in this kind of cultural way where there's sort of like therapy culture, and we talk a lot about trauma.
Mm-hmm.
And I cut my clinical teeth on trauma. My first assignments were working with Vietnam vets.
Mm-hmm.
So I think I get trauma, but I think it's a kind of it's a sort of it's an overfreighted term in the culture, and we sort of think of everything as trauma, and we're always looking for an an explanation of trauma. Like we're always looking for a trauma to explain. But I
Mm-hmm.
think that sometimes that's exactly right, and I wouldn't want to take that out of our toolbox. But it's overused, and especially, and even if there is trauma, there's that the first stage that you talk about it, and which is absolutely essential,
Mm-hmm.
is like, well, why, what happened. But the next stage is, and what can we do about it?
Mm-hmm.
And I think about this as good mother, good father, because when the kid has a boo boo, he runs to mom, and mom says, "Oh, I'm so sorry. Let me give it a kiss, and let me give you a hug." And but the good father energy, which mothers can do too, of course, is okay. Now what's the next thing to do?
Mm-hmm.
And I think too much in therapy, we're in the good mother mode.
Mm-hmm.
And the next step is, let's take responsibility for what we can take responsibility for. I mean, sometimes there's not. I mean, Viktor Frankl took responsibility, the little responsibility he had. He was in a concentration camp, and he
Mm-hmm.
said, I'm gonna eat my food slowly and with intention because I can." you know
Mm-hmm.
where can we take responsibility? Where can we take some control over what is happening to us?
Yeah, it's very like the serenity prayer that you'll encounter
Exactly.
in the recovery
Exactly.
world. God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, and the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference.
And
This
that
is
third part is the
Yeah,
really hard
that's
part.
the
But
yeah,
yeah,
tricky, very tricky.
yeah. But I think that actually, the serenity prayer just captures so much about what good therapy should be like.
Yeah. Yeah.
Is Yeah, it's those are both hard things to do, except the things we cannot change. That is hard.
That in itself is hard, because
Yeah.
even you can get stuck there, because you're not at acceptance. You just
Mm-hmm.
recognize there are things you cannot change, but you haven't
Mm-hmm.
accepted that you
Mm-hmm.
cannot
And
change them.
and if you don't accept it, and it's okay not to accept it right away, you
Yeah.
can rail and gnash your teeth. That's totally normal. But if you stay there, you become bitter,
Yeah. Yeah.
and then you
Yeah.
don't move on to the second part, which is changing the things you can change.
It is a positive masculine force, which is very lacking culturally, certainly lacking in therapy. I don't think it's a coincidence that most therapists are
Or
women these
women.
days, and
Mm-hmm.
there's sort of the feminization of the culture. And if you go on TikTok or Instagram and you see the sort of TikTokification of therapy speak, it's almost all women. And so that positive, there's this perception that any masculine response to wounding is itself toxic. It's
Mm-hmm.
and there is a lot of toxic response to it. There is a lot of suck it up. My father
Yes.
was famous for telling us to handle it, just handle it, just kind of,
Wow.
yeah. Yeah, so that was, something he got in his recovery world, which something went wrong there.
Wow.
But that's the opposite of what you're describing, which is still this very warm, supportive masculine, but it says, okay, and then what?
Right.
Now,
And it
now
is
where
a
are
both
we?
and. Like
It's a
we
both
need the
and.
first thing and then we need
Yeah.
the second thing. So it's
Yeah.
not that we don't need the like the empathy. And in therapy, that might take a long time.
To even get there.
Yeah,
Yeah.
or just the person might need to be just held kind of lovingly in their pain for a long time. And,
Mm,
going through what happened that led to this. It's just that
mm,
eventually, we move through that and then you're more into perspective taking or problem solving
mm,
or kind of looking forward. But yeah, I think you're, and this goes back to what we started about the, the sort of this feminization of therapy, feminization of a lot of fields, I think
mm,
is this is going on. And, you know, the corollary to saying that is that women might approach things differently than men,
mhm,
which again, we're not allowed to say, but it's
mhm.
true.
Yeah, especially women who are overly developed in those feminine qualities and have
Yes,
not integrated in a healthy, whole way
right,
the so-called masculine qualities. And so it
right.
becomes this really out of whack, really out of balance system where the hyperfeminization is an overemphasis on exactly the opposite of the things that you're saying need to be
Mm-hmm.
reclaimed.
Yep.
Do you think something has happened in the last few generations to make this more challenging for people, or what has shifted culturally and within the individual or the family system to contribute to this lack of balance and the
Mm-hmm.
lack of both an inner nourishing mother like Vasilisa's doll? I love that. I think it's my favorite story in the whole book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah,
This
me
little
too.
this little doll that puts her in touch with her own
Mm-hmm.
self-soothing and her own access to her inner resources. So most of us are lacking that, and then we're
Yes.
also lacking the compensatory, the masculine, the action piece
Mm-hmm.
of things. So
Mm-hmm.
what went wrong and what can be done?
That is such a big question, and I could sort of hazard a guess at what that might look like archetypally, but also like sociologically. I mean, people have been writing and talking about the sort of negative effects of sort of therapeutic culture for decades, and I was one of those people who, when those books came out, I think there was one that came out maybe in the 80s or 90s, I was like, no, but now I'm like, oh yeah, I think they sort of were onto something,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
but archetypally in some sense, the culture writ large has been sort of dominated by a very masculine mode for a long time. And, things, there's an antiadromia, things kind of become their opposite. And now in a way, there are so many places in the culture, I think, that are sort of, over feminized,
mm-hmm.
and yeah, that's probably a shocking, appalling thing to say, but I love women, right? And I run retreats for women, and I love being in that space with just women, and I often I'll hear a story about someone's workplace, and it's like all women. I'm like, oh, I wouldn't want to work with all women. I wouldn't want to work with all men. No way. But I wouldn't want to work with all women either. And it is this balancing thing. I know at a reading I gave of the book, a woman came up afterwards and she said to me kind of quietly, she said, I'm a yoga teacher. And I was like, oh, she was talking about the incredible kind of like demand for a certain kind of like very cheerful, agreeable, positivistic energy in the yoga community.
Mm,
But the shadow side of that is all of this unintegrated stuff, right? Because that's the thing. If you don't do the work of consciously developing a relationship with your ruthlessness, for example, oh, you're still going to be ruthless, but it won't be in a kind of conscious, intentional way. And which is not a point I think that I make very clearly in the book, although I think it's implied in a few places. But like, for example, with ruthlessness, what I'm really talking about is the ability to make a choice. When I'm talking about it as sort of a constructive quality, is ruthlessness is the ability to make a choice that you know is going to make someone else uncomfortable, but you need to do it because it's in service to your growth. So, the sort of somewhat silly example I give in the book is that I was in my 20s, I was seeing a therapist and it wasn't really working for me. And I was like, oh, I don't want to break up with her because it'll hurt her feelings, or, maybe she needs some money. I mean, it was like a ridiculous thing to think. And of course, as a therapist now, people think I'm like, no, it's like, I'm not your responsibility.
Yeah,
But I didn't
not
know
your
that then.
mommy.
I was like, oh no, I can't. And then I had this dream that I was driving in a car with Tony Soprano,
I love that. I love that so
right? And
much.
Tony Soprano is like absolutely ruthless, right? Like, who is it? His friend, is it Big Pussy or something, who's
Yeah.
like a turned FBI informant, and they take him on a boat and bye bye, because you got to do it. Like, what are you going to do? Like, if you're Tony Soprano, you have to do that, you know. And I needed to end this relationship with this therapist. So that's what I'm talking about with ruthlessness. But if you don't have a conscious relationship with ruthlessness, then you're going to be, backstabbing and,
Mm-hmm.
kind of this woman was clearly experiencing that at her yoga studio. So
Mm-hmm.
and the way that women do that is very different than the way men do it, because men are more comfortable with that. In general, men are more, now some, not all men, just like not all women, but in general, men are more comfortable with that. And men will come up and tell you, I really didn't like it when you did this. You need to get your act together, not do that again. And then it's done. It's over.
Right. Yeah, I think it's not, you're speaking to the sort of way that women, and everybody who's worked with women knows this. And again, this is very politically incorrect. And I think it's a little more, it'll be better received by the people who listen to this than maybe at large. But the idea that you're going to go underground with these things, and this is what it's like in an all women workplace, where there's
There's plenty of aggression.
plenty of aggression,
Yeah.
plenty of covert, this passive aggressive, covert
Mm-hmm.
aggression, where women will smile and stab you in the back in the
Yep.
same move. And so that happens. But then there's also the projection piece. And we see this
Yes.
politically. I don't know if you watched the debate the other night, but like through a Jungian lens, something like that political debate is just a projection fest,
Mm-hmm.
everything. And if you watch on Twitter, people talking about the debate
Mm-hmm.
and talking
Mm-hmm.
about the election, like no one sees reality. Everyone just sees all of their unclaimed qualities
Yes.
barfed up on the bad guy. And so the question is sort of, did this, what is, it's sort of a chicken and egg thing. And I know that Jung talks really beautifully about people who don't do the individual work, this starts to fester at the cultural level, and it
Mm-hmm.
starts to create conflicts and wars and mass psychosis and all kinds of things. And it seems that living through the times we're living through, and everyone having this awareness of how broken and messy and fucked up everything is, that maybe it's a time to go inward and to understand ourselves at this deeper level. But which came
Well, I
first,
mean,
how do we
Jung said, at one point, he said something like, it's probably in here, but I won't look for it. The most important political work any of us can do is work on our own shadow.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, I can't see how
There it
that's
is.
not true.
Yeah.
And his colleague, Eric Neumann, who was a Jewish analyst in Jung's circle, and this is right in the middle of the 20th century. So
Mm-hmm.
Neumann eventually moved to Israel, I believe. He wrote, I mean, just beautiful, beautiful, beautiful books. But one of his most important books is this little book called Depth Psychology and a New Ethic, and he wrote it after World War II and after the Holocaust. And he said, the old way of dealing with things was to project it out on the other. We can no longer afford to do that, because it's gotten too dangerous. You think about it, it's like we have nuclear weapons. We cannot do that anymore. We cannot do that. We're too destructive. So we can't, when we have a quality in ourselves that we don't like, we can't just project it on people anymore. That will be the end of humanity. And actually, I don't know that Neumann exactly says that, but that's the implication. And
Jung
at one
does.
point, what?
But Jung does. I mean,
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
pretty explicit with
At
that.
some point, someone says to Jung, do you think we're going to make it as a species? And he says, sort of, I'm collapsing a couple things he said in different places, but he said, we hang by a thin thread, and that thin thread is the psyche of man. And when someone said, are we going to make it? He said, well, I think so, but whether or not we do will depend on whether or not people do shadow work.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
And
yeah,
the first entry point to shadow work is, what do you detest in other people? What do you
right.
find irritating in other people? I think it's in the anger chapter where you have the client with a coworker that she sees all of these qualities in. And, you know, we've all had that experience where we just can't stand someone that we're working with, or we can't stand a certain political candidate.
Mm-hmm.
And so what if someone wants to embark upon something resembling reclaiming these energies, which they are projecting out on the world? What's the first step to really narrowing in on identifying them, and then what do they do about it? What's the
So, think about what really gets under your skin. And I mean, I think, Trump is that for many people. And I mean, understandably, right? The thing about projection is there's always a hook. It's
Sure.
not like you just randomly, if someone really bothers you at work, that they're probably really irritating. And if your reaction seems a little bit outsized or you're super hot about it, you're
Right.
probably projecting something of yourself. So I
Right.
think the point is to get, like, the first word that comes to mind is curious.
Mm.
Because as long as we're in condemnation mode, we
Mhm.
can't, like, sort of take in what we need to take in about it. So it's like curious. That's why a lot of people have really positive, a lot of people who hate Trump have dreams with Trump in it where Trump is a very positive figure,
Hmm.
which I think
That's
is interesting.
interesting. Yeah.
So so get curious about it and think, okay, so what is it that bothers me the most about that person? Well, it's how bossy she is. Oh, that's interesting. Is there a part of me that, am I capable of, like, maybe I'm actually a natural leader, but I've pressed that down.
Mm.
And maybe I need to kind of get in touch with my own maybe I always feel like I know what other people should be doing, but I don't say
Mhm.
it because I was told that I'm not supposed to say that. But maybe that's actually a talent that I have.
Mhm.
Maybe being bossy, that's the negative form of it. But the positive form is, I know, it's leadership. I know it needs to be done, and I'm good at delegating, or I could be good at delegating if
Mhm.
I let myself develop that. So, it can be hard to do that when it's someone that we really, really hate. But, for example, I mean, someone like Trump, I'm just sort of making this up, but, one of the things, I mean, there's many things to say about Trump, but one of the things is he's very entitled,
Mhm.
right? So if you just absolutely hate the way that he feels entitled to things, it's like, well, where's my sense of entitlement? Do I
Mm.
feel a healthy sense of deservedness? Yes. And in some people, it's to a toxic degree. But
Mhm.
but but if you apply it to yourself, is there a way that you need a little bit of that?
Mm.
And
Mhm.
and then it might, it's not, if you're doing this with a colleague, like, it's not, it's probably not like you're going to be best friends with them. Although sometimes that happens.
Mm.
Sometimes the people that really drive us crazy, when we can take back the shadow stuff, we're like, oh, actually, she's pretty cool. You
Right.
know?
Once you actually, yeah, take those projections back.
Hmm.
How do you think Jung would have answered the question, is there any hope for our species, if he knew about social media?
Yeah, I think about that. I think about
Yeah.
that.
Like, does that change the game? Because we're being fed exactly that which we hate the most and being sort of coddled in our projections and
Totally.
given access to other people who see those projections just the way that we do. And so this sort of like coalescing of the group think, it seems to make it that much harder to do that inner work to save civilization.
I agree, and I really worry about that. And maybe on the positive side, you know, our podcast reaches a lot of people because of social media. And
Right.
maybe
Right.
there's, as negative as it is, it also does have some valuable
Sure.
aspects.
Yeah.
And maybe those will preponderate, I hope.
We hope. Well,
Hmm.
I want to be respectful of your time and let you go here, but I just so appreciate you joining me for this conversation. I think it gives
Yeah,
people a lot to think about, and I expect lots of follow-up questions for you. And
great.
very excited for the new book. That's
Yeah, terrific. And
so.
I'll send you the link so you can add it to the show notes.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. But yes, just thank you so much. It's been
Yeah.
such an honor to talk to you and
No, this was a lot of fun.
great information. So, all right, till next time.